This is our April installment of our monthly webinar series here at Division 34. For those of you who this is your first time joining us, a special welcome to you. We are the Society for Environmental, Population, and Conservation Psychology of the American Psychological Association. And my name is Daniel Benkendorf. I'm the current president of Division 34. And I'm an associate professor of psychology at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City in the US. And today we are very pleased to welcome our guest, Dr. Tassiano Milfont, who's at the University of Waikato. And he's going to be sharing a talk that we've titled Toward a Robust Cross-Cultural Environmental Psychology. He is one of the most prolific scholars of applied social psychology, and his substantial body of work leverages social and behavioral science to address environmental problems along with other social problems that we face. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tassiano.
Thanks, Daniel. I'll share the screen, see if it works. Can you all see it? Oh, Daniel, can you see it?
Looks good.
Good.
I can.
Okay, thanks again, Daniel, for the invitation, and Ezra for suggesting my name to give this presentation, and for you that decide to be here and see and hear what I have to say. Daniel didn't mention, but it's really early here in New Zealand. It's 5 a.m. So I'm a bit sleepy, but I think the talk will be I'll be fine.
So yes, I really meant to. Sorry to interrupt you, Tassiano. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, I was saying good morning earlier to Tassiano, and for those of you that are unaware, it is 5 a.m. He's right, in New Zealand, and he is gracious enough to still do this for us. It's 1 p.m. It's a pleasant 1 p.m. here in New York, but not in New Zealand. Thank you, Tassiano.
Yeah, and I imagine other folks will be in different time zones, but here, being based in New Zealand, we're quite used to these because we are quite far away. So I hope to have a short presentation to give us time to have some discussion at the end. So I organized the talk into three sections. First, I will briefly mention the importance of having cross-cultural and cultural research and perspectives within psychological science broadly, and of course within environmental and conservation psychology. And then I will talk about some of my own research illustrating that approach, the approach that I take. And in particular, I will mention the need for multi-level perspectives in understanding pro-environmental behavior. And then I'll talk about the special issue that I organized with Kevin from Hong Kong that tries to promote a little bit more this cross-cultural environmental psychology perspective. So the first part on the importance of culture and cross-cultural research. I really like this old piece by Heinrich. It was I believe in the APA newsletter, and he talks about the importance of culture, and he argues that we are an ultra-cultural species, meaning that alone and stripped of our culture, we are hopeless as a species. And he makes a really strong point that without this ability to transmit culture and learn cultural norms and cultural skills would be really hard for us to survive as a species. And we have done really well because of that, from different habitats throughout the earth. So we have this ability to transmit cultural knowledge, the know-how, how to grow particular food in particular seasons and particular climates, and to transmit that, and if you remember, for most part of our history as a species, that was only oral transmission of that knowledge. And he argues that if we get the smartest person among us, that person will be unable to accumulate all that knowledge in a single lifetime. So that as a species, we develop this amazing ability to learn and to transmit this cultural knowledge for us to survive. So starting by saying that culture is really important for us as a species. But interesting enough, we don't tend to recognize that we are within a particular culture. And I really love this quote by Clyde Kluckhorn, who argues that would hardly be fish who discovered the existence of water. Meaning that when we are immersed in our own culture, it's really hard for us to understand and be aware of the cultural norms that we follow and the way things are, and the things we do. And often we recognize that aspect of what we do as part of our own culture when we expose to other cultures, or the fish would only recognize that it lives within water when it's outside the water and needs to breathe, for example. So if you've been outside from your home country, and if you travel overseas, that experience is quite noticeable. You first been abroad, so you tend to be more observant of what other people do, like how they greet. Do they get close to each other when they're greeting each other? The type of food they eat, the smells, and so on. So we tend to be much more aware of our own culture when we are outside it. And there is another really interesting, fascinating aspect of culture, and I think it can be summarized by this quote, that there are two statements about human beings that are true, that all human beings are alike and that all are different. On those two facts, all human wisdom is founded. So there is this acknowledgement that we as a species, we are alike, all humans are alike, but we are also different. We have our own background, our own history, and so on. And I would argue that the work of cross-cultural psychology tackles this tension between what's universal, what's alike among us, and what's unique among us. And I am going to make the point that in order to understand pro-environmental behavior, we need to tackle this tension really well. We need to understand what are the universal drivers for action and what are the unique aspects that will mobilize action in particular social cultural contexts. So bringing more to our discussion point today, we know that human behavior is causing major issues to the biodiversity and things and problems to other species on Earth. So much so that geologists are calling a new period in the geological history of Earth as a planet. So they have created this term, Anthropocene, a particular period in our Earth history that is influenced by human dominance towards the natural environment. And there are empirical studies showing that is indeed this period, geological period, is distinct from other periods on Earth. So we are indeed causing lots of issues. And there are some documentation of things that we have done as a species. Those two books is just to illustrate. And the analysis of disease societies, so they studied those societies that didn't manage to survive as a particular society. So those analyses suggest that humans have a general tendency to live beyond the capacity of their surrounding environment. And this tendency can result in societal collapse. In the past, they managed to move from one location to another that they had more natural resources, and some of those societies could develop again in another place. And there are some people who think like that, and they want to perhaps explore possibilities to live outside of Earth. But so far, we don't know any other planet that could sustain life like we have in this planet. And perhaps the best approach would be to try to overcome this tendency of overshooting Earth's capacity and protecting the natural environment. And Kluckelhorn again made a quite interesting point, arguing that all human societies have basic questions, and the answers to those basic 5 questions indicate the cultural values that each society takes. And so you can read the 5 main questions: what's human nature? How do we relate to nature and supernature? What's the nature of time? What's the nature of activity? And what's the nature of our relationship to other people? And again, Kluckelhorn argues that the answer to those questions indicates the particular cultural values that a particular society follows. And as you can see there, Kluckelhorn already argued that our relationship to nature is a key question for all societies, and there are 3 basic answers to that particular question. Societies can either take a mastery approach towards nature and to control nature. There is a subjugation aspect to that question. Some societies tend to accept natural phenomenon, and believe that it's a god in itself, and you need just to follow nature's desire. And the final one is a harmony approach or answer to that question, that we should fit harmoniously with nature, within nature. So I like bringing Kluckelhorn to say that this perspective, this cross-cultural perspective, and how we relate to nature is not new. So I'm not the first one to argue that we need a cross-cultural perspective when understanding our relationship to nature, because anthropologists, cultural anthropologists have been arguing that that's the case for a long time. And indeed, in one edition of the handbook of cross-cultural psychology, there was a chapter on environmental psychology. So folks within cross-cultural psychology already argue that we need to understand our relationship with nature through cultural lenses for a long time. And I was fortunate enough that I contributed to a chapter on the handbook of environmental and conservation psychology, bringing this cross-cultural perspective to our field. So of course I can't detail everything on that particular book chapter, but because it's a book chapter, I had an opportunity to go a little bit more in detail about different theoretical perspectives that we could use within our field that takes this cultural lenses approach quite more seriously. So I recommend you to read if you're interested. Another really important and more recent development in the field is this recognition that our work within psychology is weird, which means that the majority of our findings come from populations from Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. Perhaps some of you are already familiar with this paper. That's now a seminal paper. Other and previous cultural and cross-cultural psychologists have been making this point for a long time. But I think this paper provide a new emphasis to, to challenge the way psychology had been developing theories and proposing empirical findings as a discipline. Often theories are developed in US, let's say, within psychology, and there is this ambition that a particular theory is universal. But often these theories are based on data from psychology students, university psychology students from a single society. And the main point that these authors make is that the majority population are not included in these findings. So how can we argue that's a psychological theory if it cannot be representing the whole of the population, the whole of humans? So they then synthesized that piece in a Nature short article, arguing that most people are not worried. And this is the case because the majority of people are not from Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. And more recently, there is this quite interesting paper by Mustafa and colleagues arguing that we should try to develop a psychology for all humans. So I'm presenting these to argue that my approach within environmental psychology also takes that perspective quite seriously. Yeah, so we should challenge our theories and our findings and ask ourselves if those findings are indeed universal or they are indeed unique to a particular culture. So again, bringing that tension between what's universal and what's unique to our theorizing and our empirical findings. And finally, another perspective I mentioned in the beginning is to take this multi-level perspective quite seriously. So any particular behavior is nested within the individual, and there are individual characteristics that are going to be motivating the individual to perform that behavior. Within environmental psychology, we know that biological sex, political orientation, values, and attitudes are important drivers of pro-environmental behavior, but individuals live within households, so individuals are nested within households. So the size of the house is going to influence how much water, electricity you consume, and so on. And households are within regions, and regions have different policies. There are regions that would favor recycling, let's say, and they would have a recycling system, but others might not. And regions are nested within nations, and broader country level, nation level policies are going to influence how regions operate and how households and individuals. So we summarized that perspective in a piece in 2016. Ezra wrote that piece with me. So a cross-cultural environmental psychology should also take this multi-level perspective quite seriously to understand the individual is nested within these broader categories or broader contexts. Okay, so that was an overview of my take on the importance of culture for our work. So I'm going to illustrate this perspective with some of my own work. So I'll talk about some within country studies. So I'm looking at findings from a particular culture, but I'm also going to provide examples of cross-cultural work where I'm comparing findings across many nations. So I'll start with a within country study. And this was done here in New Zealand. So there are, we used data from this study from the New Zealand Attitudes and Values study. Is a longitudinal project led by Professor Chris Sibley that I'm fortunate enough to be involved. And we've been tracking people since 2009. So we have now 11 waves of data. And just as a parenthesis, we have now published quite a bit looking at environmental attitudes like climate change over time here in New Zealand, and there will be more to come now that we have 10 waves of data. In this particular study, we're interested to look at the indigenous peoples here in New Zealand. So scholars have argued that indigenous peoples have a stronger connection to the land, but there are not a lot of empirical tests of that assumption. So you want to test it here. So would Maori, the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, would Maori have higher levels of environmental values than non-indigenous New Zealanders? So that was the first question. And then we want to find out what drives that, if indeed is stronger or higher levels for Maori. So we use social identity theory to look at what are the aspects of Maori identity that would explain that higher levels of environmental values, if we indeed find it. So we conduct 2 studies to test or to examine those questions. So first, with a broader New Zealand AVS sample, we found that indeed Maori placed higher values on protecting the environment than other New Zealanders, but not Asian New Zealanders, which we found quite interesting. But overall, we provide empirical support for these stronger connections between indigenous peoples and the environment. And now there are many other studies showing that that's empirically that's the case, you know. So we are providing support for that theoretical claim. And surprising to us, we imagine that it would be more religiosity, you know, as an aspect of Maori identity that would explain that connection to the natural environment, but we found that was sociopolitical consciousness. That aspect of Maori identity that can be defined as the extent to which participants recognize the importance and stand up for Maori political rights. That aspect of that identity explain the relationship or that stronger relationship with natural environment. Okay, so that's one example. I have published quite a bit looking at this phenomenon that David Uzel from the UK, a quite famous environmental psychologist from the UK, he argued in this 2000 paper that he called this phenomenon environmental hyperopia, or what we are now calling spatial bias. Is the tendency of people to perceive and rate environmental problems as more worrying when they take place at greater distances. So I have the map there, so you see where I am. You know, I'm right here in New Zealand. So bringing this environmental hyperopia, we can argue that New Zealanders would perceive environmental problems as worse there, somewhere than here. But this applies to any country that we know. So individuals tend to believe environmental problems are worse there, somewhere, than in their own locality. So we test that with data of 30 samples from 26 countries, and it was published several years back, and it was a study led by Wesley Schultz. But we wrote this piece while I was on sabbatical working with him in California. So I'm not going to go into the detail, but apart from Romania, and we have our speculations why Romanian was an outlier in this particular sample, but across all nations, we indeed support these spatial bias. That is, respondents from these countries tend to believe environmental problems are worse there in other countries than in their own country. I don't have a slide here, but there is a now famous study testing that across 18 countries as well, led by Robert Gifford, that some of you might know from Canada. So in this paper, we want to extend those findings from 18 countries to a larger sample of countries, and we found evidence for the bias. More recently, I want to see if that would be robust within a single nation. So here it's a map of Brazil and all the states within Brazil. So we want to see if respondents from each state in Brazil would think that environmental problems are worse nationally than in their own state. But we call that a bias because your state belongs to the nation, and the same for the cross-cultural studies. Your country belongs to the world. So it's similar to an optimistic bias or better than average bias that has been identified within psychology, that people tend to believe that they are better than average, in terms of looks, intelligence, and so on. But that is a bias because if everyone believes they are better than average, then the average does not exist, so it's a bias. So the same applies here. So your state belongs to the nation, so to believe that environmental problems are worse nationally than in your state, and you identify that across all states, then we can show that there is a bias. And indeed, this is what we found. So this sample size, quite a large sample, and we managed to collect data from all states, as I said. So we found that Brazilian respondents rate environmental problems as much worse nationally than at the local state, so supporting the spatial bias. And we found that the variability across states was quite small, only 2% of the variability could be explained by cross-state variance. So it means that the finding was quite robust, So we found a spatial bias. People tend to rate the extent of environmental problems as worse nationally in Brazil than in their own state, and this was quite consistent across all states. There is another area that I have published quite a bit now, is looking at social dominance, extending social dominance theory to environmentalism. So scholars, including myself, have argued that although this theory has been developed and applied to understand hierarchy within social groups, it can be extended to understand hierarchies within humans and the natural environment. So we have broadened the dominance focus of social dominance orientation to understand the hierarchical relations between humans on top and the natural environment, including other species below. And I put this paper there as 2013. In one of the studies, we provide some cross-cultural evidence, but I'm having it there because it was the main paper where I make that argument. But more recently, I want to test the relationship between social dominance and environmentalism across nations. So in that initial study and many other studies, individuals have found a negative association between social dominance orientation and many measures of environmentalism, meaning that if individuals place greater emphasis on social dominance or the desire for hierarchy, they tend to be less engaged in pro-environmental issues. So here we had 25 nations. So and we had three main measures of environmentalism. Just going to illustrate with one. Here it's a measure of environmental citizenship. So signing petitions in pro of the natural environment, voting for politicians that promote environmental actions, and so on. So this is a forest plot and looking at the correlations between SDO in this measure across all the nations. And you can see that there is variability going from minus 35 in Sweden to positive 16 in Ghana, and also a positive correlation in the US. But overall, when you provide a meta-analytical summary of that, you find a negative association of 0.15. So overall, we found this consistent association, negative association between SDO and pro-environmental measures. But as I said, it varied across countries. So using that multi-level perspective, we want to identify what are the factors within nations that justify that variability. So we're looking at cross-level interaction or moderators of those associations at the individual level. So we tested three main moderators, societal moderators. Here I'm just illustrating with the HDI, the Human Development Index. And we found that the negative association between SDO and environmental citizenship was stronger at higher levels of human development. So bring that finding to a more positive light, we found that the lower participants' scores on social dominance orientation, the more they engage in environmental citizenship actions. And this effect is stronger in nations with better human development indicators. Okay, so cross-cultural perspectives can, in this case, show a finding that might be universal of this negative association, but bringing a multi-level perspective can identify what are the features of a particular society that makes that association stronger or weaker. And in this case, we show that Human Development Index moderates that association. In another piece, we look at drivers of climate change action. So we want to identify what are the other drivers of action. And the main question we had was, would people be motivated to act when they believe mitigating climate change will promote a better society in the future? And driving this study was a theoretical model developed by Paul Bain and Yoshi Kashima that's called Collective Futures. Is looking at how imagining the future of our society could mobilize action. And we applied that theoretical framework to climate change action. So we had participants from 24 countries. These are university students, but we also had some community samples from 10 of these countries to double check if our finds were robust beyond university students. So I'm not going to provide a lot of detail about this, this study, but overall we found that indeed imagining a future society where climate change has been addressed mobilized individuals to act. And that was quite consistent across across societies, and the strength of this association between future thinking and climate change action was similar to the strength of the association between placing greater emphasis on climate change or the importance of the issue and the intention to act. So we argue that our findings in a way provide support to this charge, you know, that we are trying, you know, by acting to address climate change, we can have a better society. So this is why we framed our study in terms of core benefits. You know, by acting to address climate change, there will be core benefits that would spill over to other aspects of our society. I have published other studies, you know, taking this cross-cultural perspective, but I don't want to go on them. So these are just to illustrate how I have been applying this thinking, this cross-cultural perspective, and addressing the tension between what's universal and what's unique in my work for many years now. The final part I want to talk about briefly is this special issue that Kevin and I just published. And, you know, Kevin, I provide some illustration of my own work. Kevin has done quite a bit of work. Like myself, he has some training in cross-cultural psychology and environmental psychology. So he's combining the two fields, and he has published quite impressive work. And I have the same training, you know, in both environmental and cross-cultural psychology. So I'm merging the two fields. So this special issue in a way is the culmination of our thinking and our contribution to developing this junction of fields, if you will. So we argue that human environment interactions are culture bound. That is, you know, with these multi-level perspectives, that we can only understand human environment interactions through a cultural lens, because the cultural norms in our society are going to influence our behavior, is influencing our behavior. And of course, the historical context of societies as well. So this is a short statement, but within this statement is this cross-cultural perspective, the importance of cross-cultural perspectives and multi-level perspectives within the field that we claim. So we argue that we need to develop an integrative and culturally informed understanding of these relationships, and that environmental problems are global problems. They cross borders. So to address them, we need collective action. You know, so we also need behaviors that mobilize those culturally informed individuals. And that those actions hopefully would have implications cross borders as well. So these are, you know, the first statement of the main claim we make in the article. but we provide two large bibliometric reviews of the Journal of Environmental Psychology to show that we are indeed publishing Word findings. Most of our findings are from Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. And as you can see that English-speaking countries dominate publications in the journal. It's not a surprise finding, because English is the lingua franca in science nowadays. But it didn't used to be. If you know a little bit of history, you know that Latin was the language used in science, and then French became one main language. But now we are using English, so there is no surprise that English-speaking countries dominate publications within environmental psychology, but the same finding applies to other disciplines as well. This lower graph here illustrated we coded studies that had single country authors or multi-country authors. And as you can see, most of the publications within the Journal of Environmental Psychology has single country authors only. But historically, there is an increase in cross-country collaborations, which is quite positive. This is a network, a visual illustration of the connections. And you can see that it's a quite stronger connection between the US scholars and Europe. And you can see that not even New Zealand is represented in this map. So our folks here, we need to publish more in this journal and other journals in the field. But as I said, if this is a historical, overall historical illustration, but if you did, let's say, for every 5 years of publications in the journal, you see that this network has increased over time, which is a really positive finding. So we go to discuss particular aspects that we believe are quite important in the development of these cross-cultural environmental psychology field. First is theorizing and research planning. We argue that when developing theories or assessing theoretical models, that we should be placing emphasis on cultural differences, because everything we do with this psychology is also culturally bound. So if a theoretical model was developed in the US, that model has social historical constraints to it and might not apply to other social historical contexts. So it's just making us aware of that when developing and assessing theoretical models. And of course, also when planning our research. So we might be wanting to test if our model is universal, finds are universal or not. So bringing that to the forefront of our findings. And then we discuss about the issues of collecting individual level data. If you're starting a new project, what are the issues you need to be aware of, like translating the measures, testing for measurement invariance of your measures, and so on. And we said that collecting new individual level data can be quite time consuming, but Kevin and myself have used these publicly available data sets, freely accessible, such as the World Values Study, the European Values Study. So we provided a list of all these data sets and those data sets that have environmental questions. And we made that list available on the Open Science Framework. So it means that you don't need to collect data. The data might already be available to you for testing particular aspects that you are interested. But if you're collecting new data, we also talking about sampling of countries, how to choose the countries that you're gonna collect data from. Often these are based on convenience. You might know colleagues in those particular countries, so you ask them to collect data for you. But when developing our field, I think we need to place greater emphasis on how to choose the countries. And we provide an example in our article illustrating how you can choose theoretically particular countries to test claims that you might have in your model. And we also talked about reporting the findings. So we noticed in our bibliometric review that not many articles in the Journal of Environmental Psychology provide any information about the sample, not even the country. So there is an assumption that the participants came from the country of the authors of that piece, but might not be the case. So we argue that we need to provide more information to readers. And of course, the special issue has other articles. I'm glad to say that my own contribution to this special issue was rejected. So we had a quite tough editorial process, and Kevin was quite tough. And as I said, my own contribution was rejected. But at the end, we had 5 pieces. And this table illustrates what they did. So again, I'm not going to go into the detail, but we decided we chose this piece because they illustrate important aspects of cross-cultural environmental psychology. So we use them as exemplars in a way of this field. Okay, so some conclusions. I have argued that the way we relate to the natural environment is culturally patterned. So you can remember, again, human-environment interactions are culture bound. So it's important to take this into consideration. We must work collectively to solve environmental problems and to adapt to our changing world. And this requires a better and cross-cultural understanding of drivers of collective action. So this is something that I emphasize quite a bit. And our bibliometric review in the special issue indicates that our field lacks cultural diversity in both its research participants. Again, our finds tend to be weird, and also our authors. So we need more cross-border, cross-continent collaborations. And I argue that my colleagues and I have been trying to tackle this question. So that's me. So we'll open for questions. And if you have any other questions afterwards, please get in contact. Follow me on Twitter. But that's it. That's me. So, Daniel, do we have questions already?
First, just thank you so much for that. That was an excellent talk, Tassiano. Really, really appreciate your contributions to our field and your contribution today to our community. Really, really appreciate that. Yeah, so folks who are attending, you can use the Q&A function if you haven't already to post a question. You can also just post it into the chat and I will read your question and we'll see how many we can get through, how many Tassiano can address before time is up. And just while we wait for some questions to appear, Tassiano, I can start us off. I had a question for you, and that is, I really think it's so important that more of these cross-national collaborations, cross-cultural collaborations occur. So many of the elements and points that you made, I think, are so important for the development of our field. And I'm just wondering what advice you would give to early career researchers who maybe it's a perception, maybe it's a reality, but they feel that they lack international connections, but they wish to pursue a cross-cultural research agenda, modeled after something like what you've done. What would you say to them?
Good question. I think we are in a really interesting period of our discipline. I didn't mention, but I'm quite involved in the open science movement. And there are many large-scale projects that young folks can be involved. I got involved by myself. So you have the, what's the project name? Is the psychological accelerator. So it's or the many labs. I was involved in the many labs, now involved in this accelerator. So these are large scale projects to test claims within our field or replicate findings. So one recommendation is to get involved in open science movement, so you can get involved in these broader collaborations. You can start small, by knowing if you know someone, like, of course, due to the pandemic, and maybe for environmental reasons, you shouldn't be traveling too much anymore in the future. But if you attend a conference, you might get in contact with someone. Like my collaboration started like that. I met folks at conferences and we start chatting. We had similar ideas, and I'll say, oh, I can collect data in Brazil, in New Zealand, if you collect in these countries, and then we can collaborate. But as I said, Kevin and I provide the list of publicly available data sets. So if you have some statistical knowledge on how to analyze data, you can easily have access. We all have access to these data sets. They have over 50 countries. And for example, the World Value Survey, these are representative samples from all the countries. So you can make quite stronger claims, based on the findings. Of course, it's not going to have all the measures, it's constrained by the measures that they have there. But you can use to answer some of your initial questions, and it can lead to some cross-cultural collaborations where you can test your own questions with measures you're interested. But these are the three main ones I would suggest. Get involved with open science and the broader collaborations they have within the movement. Get in contact with other people who might be in the same career stage that you are, and use these publicly available data sets.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think that's helpful for early career folks, and really for everyone who may want to go and sort of follow your footsteps. There's a question here from Marcia Rossi, and I apologize to any of you who I mispronounce your name. But the question reads, when you did your study on social dominance orientation in relationship to environmentalism, what were the three measures of environmentalism that you used? And given that this was cross-cultural, did you feel that the measures were appropriate for the cultures used?
Good question. So those three questions we also use in the nature climate change piece that I mentioned about collective futures and future thinking. So we had the environmental citizenship measure, like signing petitions, voting for green politicians. Another one was a private sphere behaviors, so recycling, reducing use of cars, reducing electricity use, and so on. So as a validated measure of that. And finally, we had a more behavioral measure. We we donate some money to participants. So we said that imagine if you won this draw that we have as part of the study. How much money would you donate to an environmental organization? So we use that more economic behavioral measure of donating money to an organization. So those measures have been used across countries. For that particular study, unfortunately, I didn't test for measurement invariance. I should have tested for measurement invariance. But one thing that I can say is that because we used a meta-analytical summary, like the forest plot I presented, we're not assuming that those measures are going to be the same or the associations are going to be the same across countries. So we can see the variability in the forest plot and then test for predictors of that variability. But in the particular social dominance article, we test from the measurement invariance of social dominance, which was, in our view, the main measure. But Kevin have noted that was an issue in that publication, that I didn't test for measurement invariance of the pro-environmental measures as well. So it's something for me to do. So if you are interested in that, please, send me an email and we can talk about it.
All right, thank you. The next question we have is from Timothy Folqueret, and it starts with, thanks a lot for your talk, Tassiano. What do you think could be the role of ethical committees to improve the visibility of non-weird cultural insights in our research field? And thanks from a postdoc in Canadian forest management.
Cool. Yeah, so I can give the example of the New Zealand context. New Zealand was founded with a treaty between the crown, the English crown, and the indigenous peoples, the Maori, here in New Zealand. So the Treaty of Waitangi, it's a founding document for our nation here. So any study, any ethical application, you need to discuss the importance of your study for the indigenous peoples here. So perhaps one initial approach would be to understand the implications of your study to minority groups in your particular society. And these are within societies, but of course, as a field, we need to be aware, and I think the field as a whole is much more aware of this issue, because often there is this claim, of universality, and folks develop a theory, and this is not new, like people recognize that Freud's theory were quite defined by the social historical period when he developed his theoretical models. So this challenge is not new, but I think we need to be more vocal in those challenges, that theoretical models that are developed in US based on samples from university students should be challenged. And I had some really interesting examples, because New Zealand is a small country. I tried to publish, then it said, well, who cares about the New Zealand findings? Or they ask us to have New Zealand on the title. And this happened, I'm Brazilian, it happened with myself and colleagues in Brazil. They say, well, who cares? So what I mean is not only to ethical applications, but also how we consume psychological findings, that we should challenge that. And we also should place greater emphasis in findings from other parts of the world. And I remember that Kitayama, professor from the US, He was the editor of Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin for a period. And he said, I'm going to place emphasis on studies that do not use university samples and come from outside of the US. That was a really important editorial decision. And we managed to publish a paper there during that period, because before they would only publish findings from the US, let's say. So how can we go beyond these word findings if we are not place emphasis on findings from other cultural perspectives? So I'll take that challenge broader, it's not only taking into consideration the importance of our studies to minorities, indigenous populations when applying for ethics, but when planning our studies, but also when we consuming psychological studies.